the call. As the Senior Community Philanthropy Officer at Communities Foundation of Texas, Ashley's portfolio is focused on economic security. She spends most of her time building North Texas's nonprofits' capacity to become more effective community asset builders. Her goal is to support nonprofits through grant making and capacity building so they can connect their work to impact systems change. Ashley believes systems change paves the road to effective policy creation, which we know is rooted in grassroots research and proven best practices. Ashley currently serves on several advisory boards, including Workforce Matters Steering Committee, Asset Funders Program Committee, and International Rescue Committee's Center for Economic Opportunity, CDFI Advisory Board. Ashley spends any free time in Arkansas with her parents or at the park with her husband, her 2-year-old daughter, and her 7-year-old son. Ashley, welcome to tonight's panel discussion. Next, I will be introducing Cynthia A. Cass, and for anyone who wonders, yes, we are related. She is my amazing mother, and so she gets all the credit for all the kind things you all say and know about me because she was my perfect role model. Cynthia A. Cass is currently retired after 19 years as a grants administrator at the Meadows Foundation. Her responsibilities included managing the grants process from the initial receipt of a grant through funding or a declination of funding. She conducted pre-grant interviews and was responsible for all online and phone inquiries from potential grantees. She reviewed, edited summaries, and produced the board packet for proposals going before the board at each meeting for approval each month. After grants meetings, Cynthia managed the award process to include producing contracts, approving payments, and had the responsibility for audit compliance. In addition to that role, she also managed 2 programs, the Charitable Schools Program, which granted more than 450 grants to middle and high school students for community and volunteer service. And she also managed the Matching Gifts Program. She holds an associate paralegal degree from El Centro Community College and a Bachelor of Science degree in business from Laterno University. Prior to employment at the Meadows Foundation, she worked for 16 years as a paralegal for a major oil and gas company in corporate law. In that role, she incorporated companies, produced bylaws, resolutions, minutes, and board packets for 66 subsidiaries. Ms. Cass is the author of Against All Odds, Success After Teen Pregnancy. Yes, my mother had me as a teen, but that's another panel discussion. Her book was purchased by ISDs for use as a textbook and resource in teen pregnancy programs throughout Texas. She's also a motivational speaker. She has made multiple presentations to Region 10, the Texas Education Agency, and often travels to schools throughout Texas to conduct presentations to students and teachers on success after teen pregnancy. She received the She Row Award from TEA and the She Knows Where She's Going Award from Girls Inc. Her volunteer projects include working with the homeless and various nonprofits that encourage and support teen parents and at-risk women, such as Dawson State Jail, Allie's House, Promise House, and Attitudes and Attire. In her spare time, she enjoys baking, candy making, and spending time with her daughter, which would be me, and her grandson, Jackson Cole, and she spearheads our family's business, Chocolate Affair. Welcome, Ms. Cass.
Hello, glad to be here.
And last but not least, Ashley Douglas, Senior Director of Southern Dallas Thrives with United Way of Metropolitan Dallas. Ashley is a proud Dallas native. She brings a comprehensive perspective in working as a relationship maven and consensus builder. Her professional experiences in the philanthropic, education, and private sectors have aided in her continuous growth as a leader. Upon transitioning into United Way, Ashley served as the Director of Community Health and Wellness, where she managed all programs and grant portfolios for adult health initiatives ranging from nutrition education to mental and behavioral health efforts. She currently oversees United Way Southern Dallas Thrives work in partnership with PepsiCo and Frito-Lay North America. This initiative takes an innovative macro-level approach to the cross-functionality of corporate and philanthropic spaces and solving complex societal issues. Outside of work, Ashley thoroughly enjoys cultural experiences through world travel. She also has a passion for empowering youth to continuously establish and achieve their levels of success and is known as a rock star mentor. Ashley holds a master's degree in both social work and public administration from the University of Texas at Arlington. Welcome, Ashley. So I think you know by now we have an amazing group of panelists, and for time purposes, we are going to jump right into tonight's discussion. And we will ask, if you will, if you can hold your questions to the end. We have some pre-selected questions, and so we want to be sure we get all of those answers. And of course, when time permits, you'll be allowed to ask additional questions. So question number one from a panelist, and all of you can answer as you please. What advice do you have for newly started nonprofits who are interested in connecting with funders? And either one of you can go first.
I'll go. It's really important to conduct your due diligence on the funder prior to submitting your grant proposal. You need to review their website, determine if they have any specific areas of interest, search their 990 or annual report if available to look for programs or projects similar to what you are proposing, and determine at what dollar amount did they fund this project. And if your organization is fairly new, have you considered collaborating with other nonprofits who have similar programs? Determine from the grant guidelines how often you can submit a proposal. It's very important to really follow the grant guidelines. Also be aware that some funders allow you to withdraw a proposal in the event it maybe isn't a good match for funding at this time, which will therefore allow you to submit an additional proposal. And the reason for that is because often funders, such as the Meadows Foundation, only allow one proposal within a 12-month period. And so that would be some steps I think would be important for newly started nonprofits.
Thank you, Ms. Cass.
I'll go next. I'll say, I think it's really important to be clear internally of your overall goals. Oftentimes I feel like we look at the funder, but I think organizationally, especially for our newer organizations, it's really important to be clear about your vision for your program or your organization, because when you're actually clear on that, it allows for you to relay that in a way that makes it compelling to the funder. So I think that's a small piece of the overall process, but I really feel like it's actually one of the most important parts to consider. So be clear on your vision, be clear on your overall goals. And I would also add to that to have some sort of proven track record in your work. Oftentimes funders are looking for opportunities to plug into impact work that organizations have a proven history of doing. And I know that smaller organizations are not always the best at sort of telling those stories of the work that they have been doing. So hone in on your story and be clear about your overall vision. I think those are two really important facets to consider when you're wanting to engage with funders.
Ashley, that was great. You bring up a lot of great points. Ashley McIver, would you like to add anything to that question?
I just say, I think the simple answer for us is, I don't know. You can come to us at any point in time. I think the wisest thing for you to do would be what Cynthia said, is to understand, and Ashley, understand what your goal is, what you're trying to accomplish, so that when you do come, you'll be very clear about what so if you didn't do your research or whatever the case, you're just trying to strike up a relationship, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I've been in situations where an organization wasn't a good fit necessarily for any funding, but they wanted feedback on some information. So from my standpoint, I think that's what my role is to help build the capacity of, regardless if they, in hopes that one day that you may, if your goals or your programs fit with our funding strategies, but ultimately I think we're here as a community foundation to be a resource. So I would say reach out. We'll let you know if your programs align with our funding. If not, you want to get feedback, we're happy to do that. Obviously, time-wise, we can't just be giving a lot of feedback willy-nilly. So I want to be transparent about that. But at the same time, if our schedule permits and we have the time, we'd love to establish that relationship. And the other piece of that is if we're not a good fit, we know other funders. So we can always do an intro to other funders that would be a good fit for you.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. I think just in my experience too, as a fundraising professional, my next question is always one that I feel like teams who are on the fundraising side sit around the table and kind of ponder and wonder if it's possible. And this is mainly for both Ashleys, because I know Cynthia is no longer employed at the foundation, but she can speak to when she was. But does your organization, or is your organization open to meeting with potential grantees prior to submission of proposals to offer guidance or answer questions?
I would say we are. I think United Way specifically does this in a very formalized way for our community impacts grants process. There's always kind of an intro meeting with potential organizations that we're looking to fund to kind of give an overall scope of our process and what that looks like. And it also allows potential grantees to ask questions about our process and about some of the things that we're looking for. We have a kind of a unique perspective in that we have a team of expertise internally that really works hand in hand with organizations and individuals who represent organizations to kind of walk through that process as much as we can, being a grantor, and provide some background information and, you know, sort of, I guess, work to get organizations kind of comfortable with the process. Because specifically for our community impacts grants, it's on a 3-year cycle, and it's a very intense process. For other grant programs and, you know, other grant opportunities that we have, it may not be as in depth as that particular grant process. And so we have some, you know, pools of funding that are geared towards emergency related issues and things of that sort, where you will have a different process. But I think for the most part, we do have and lean really heavily on our internal team of experts to help guide and provide, you know, direction and information as much as possible to potential grantees.
Thank you.
Yeah, I say, you know, again, simple answer is yes, you can. You know, obviously after your grant is submitted, then, you know, we can't do too much about that, but we welcome, especially if it's just does this align, right? Or are we, you know, is this something, I say this because we're trying to do our part to be very clear and transparent about the things that we fund. So when we put out a RFP, I think our job is to say, these are what we will fund, this is what we won't fund. And so it can be very clear to you guys, so you won't spend your time wasting filling out a grant that you won't get. So I think a little onus is on us to be very specific, but there's nothing wrong with calling up and saying, hey, you know, this is my thought. This is what we're going to potentially send over. You know, what do you think about that? What are your thoughts? And we're happy to do that. So I would say I would always err on the side of calling. Call us and ask.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Cass?
I think generally the phone call is an excellent idea. At Meadows, this is my experience, we weren't always able to, you know, meet prior to you sending the grant proposal, which it's requested often. Can you come? We want to show you. And many of these organizations are doing such wonderful work and they want us to see it, but we weren't able to. But I think to make the phone call is very important, and it just kind of starts the relationship. It starts to build a relationship where the grantee is comfortable and then we would be comfortable. And so I think that visits are made. It's just that you can't make a visit to every organization. But I think a lot of effort is made to make those visits and to answer those calls and to be very transparent.
Thank you. The next question that I think, and all of these questions are questions that I've either asked funders or had the desire to ask, and maybe figured it out on my own throughout my fundraising career. But once a grant is submitted to your organization, what is the internal process that happens, and what does the turnaround time look like?
How's the sausage made, right? Woo. So I'll start, and I'll just be open and honest with you around CFT, as we've just launched kind of a new strategy. So we are building the sausage as it's getting its casing and all that stuff. So we have the four kind of our four pillars. So once a grant is submitted, you know, I think the simple answer, it could take anywhere between 4 to 6 months. That's ideal. COVID, don't go with that timeline, because it's a whole different timeline that is not okay, but you know, nobody is okay right now in COVID. So give us a little grace, because the timelines are not sustainable or okay for you guys as a nonprofit. But in a normal environment, expect 4 to 6. And the reason I say that is because our board has to approve our grants. And so our cycles are typically, the board meets 4 times a year. So we try to structure our grant deadlines and all those things around when the deadline's up, then we can read and call them out and process and weed it down to however many we're gonna submit to the board. The board approves. Once the board approves, then we notify the nonprofit, and then the checks can be made and we'll go through the accounting process. So that, you know, think about that, you know, I'll give an example of the LOI. So previous years we had the LOI, many of you may have applied for it. It was due on April the 1st. We looked at it, you know, all our things up until, I don't know, and I'll also say it has to do with the volume too. So we used to get around 600 plus applications, and we had to read all of them. And so capacity wise, it just takes us time to read all that. And so from April till around April to around June or July, we have to prep, read, call it out, sort, calibrate, and then we have to do our end to prep for the board. So then we have to do all the, I don't know, the advocating and lobbying and all that stuff to get things to the board, and then the board approves. So it's a little long process, but that's kind of how it's made at CFT.
Okay.
And I would kind of piggyback off of that. I agree with a lot with what Ashley said. I would add probably another 2-month time frame to that, just because of our preparation time. If I can be very honest and transparent, y'all, it's a lot of work. There is a lot of planning that goes into this. Like Ashley mentioned, you know, we get upwards of between 600 and 800 applications every grant cycle. And you were talking about a team or a department of 12 to 15 people that are responsible for kind of reading all of those particular applications. And so, you know, there's like sort of a month's worth of prep, pre-trainings where we're building trainings for potential grantees. And we have a 3-step process at United Way. There's the LOI, then there's the invitation to actually apply. Then there is like a visit that takes place where we learn a little bit more about your work and evaluate if it makes sense. And then we bring it back internally and we have sort of a caucus type of situation, like Ashley mentioned, to figure out, you know, where the advocacy goes as it relates to organizations that we're potentially working to fund. Then it goes in for board approval. Then it comes back to our department to make sure that we are all good with the decisions that have been made. And then we notify organizations from there. So it's an extremely extensive process. It is a lot of work. This is the place I always ask organizations to please practice some grace with the funding community because it is not for the faint at heart, but we are working diligently nonstop to work to ensure that we're able to make the most informed decisions throughout this process. So anywhere I would say from, I'd say 5 to 7 months total for the entire process that we spend on our big community impact grants, our 3-year grant cycle process.
Thank you. Ms. Cass?
Okay. I reviewed Meadows grant guideline just to be sure that the process was still the same, and it appears to be. So let me tell you, for the 19 years that I was there, how this went. When a grant proposal is received, it goes to the senior vice president. He takes the initial look at it to determine if it meets the criteria for funding by us, if it's one of our areas of interest or a special project. And if that's the case, then it's assigned to a program officer. Now, program officers within the foundation can review any type of proposal, but they do have areas of specialty. In other words, we have someone who sort of focuses on education, mental health, the environment, civic and public affairs. So it goes to a program officer. The program officer is going to take a look at the proposal. They're going to carefully review it. And then they will do what we call a write-up. So when we get the proposal and it's 20 to 30 pages, and it's determined that we are going to put this forward for review by the board, it is then summarized down to 1 to 2 pages. And the organization will often be contacted and ask if they have photographs, if you have client stories. We're just trying to enhance the reader, the board members. And at that point, I was responsible for getting all the pieces from the program officers. And then I would prepare the board notebook. For about 15 years, we met monthly, and we put forward about 28 to 30 organizations each month. Currently, they are meeting 5 times a year. And it is a lot of work, and the process takes a lot of time. And when you're an organization on the other end waiting to hear, it's really hard to not know. The not knowing, sometimes you think, well, we're not going to make it because we haven't heard anything. So you get the phone calls and you reassure. It doesn't mean that you're not going to be funded. And so it takes a lot of patience. It takes a lot of work. And eventually it gets into that board notebook. It goes to the board. They approve it. After the approval process, the day after the board meeting, the program officers contact the nonprofit organizations to announce that you have received the award. And then I would handle the back end, which would be the contracts and the payments.
So would you say that process took like 4 to 6 months or 4 to 8 months?
3 to 4 months. And in the case of an emergency, it's important that you reflect. Let's say you want to submit a proposal and you would like to maybe be considered for funding sooner than the 3 to 4 months. It doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen. So you would need to reflect in your proposal and on your cover letter that you have an emergency situation.
And one thing, if I can add to that, Tameka, I just want to say that the funding process at that point, once awarded, is over maybe for the organization, but not for the funder. There are still mid-year reports, which United Way is actually in the middle of this right now. We spent the last 90 days preparing for mid-year reports and mid-year site visits to check in on all of our grantee portfolios to make sure that, impact is being made at the scale, or what modifications and changes we may need to make for the remainder of the grant period. And then there's that end of grant period visit and kind of check in to talk about results and overall successes and things to reconsider from that grant period right before you roll into the next one. So this is an ongoing process. I say that to say this is an ongoing process for funders. It does not stop for us. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking about that as well.
Well, let me add one thing. I guess maybe the difference, well, it's not, when you're thinking about funding and just thinking about different organizations, I think Ashley made the comment about different pools of funding and they operate differently. So the LOI would be our general kind of operations, which we would consider as our kind of small dollar grants. It's, you know, it's 2-page application. So it's pretty quick. There's not a lot of reporting because it's 1 year. And so there's not a whole lot of back end, sorry about that, with that. However, our multi-year funding, you know, you kind of, the more money it is, the more kind of strings are attached, right? And so we ask a little bit more. And so it's a longer relationship, I guess you could, it's less transactional and it gets more into, because we're seeking kind of transformational change.
Thank you all for that. And just in keeping with the time, because we want to be respectful of our time frame, Ashley, you brought up a good question. And so all of you can answer, or just either of you, it doesn't matter, but we want to start getting to a close just because we want to give the attendees time to answer questions. But you brought it up, Ashley, and said about multi-year funding, a little bit more strings attached. So my question is, does CFT, does United Way grant multi-year requests? And Ms. Cass, if you want to answer about your experience during your time at Meadows, feel free to do so.
Yeah, so I'm happy to start. So yes, we do multi-year grants. I think our goal is to do more of them. So this is kind of part of our kind of reorg, where we're, again, kind of trying to be a lot more cohesive, a little bit more strategic around our funding pools. And so that looks like a lot more opportunities to get more organizations funding. I think historically, if you kind of look at our trend funding patterns, kind of historically, you had the multi-year funding was, you know, anywhere up from, I would say, $750 to millions of dollars. I mean, that was what you do. And you're looking at multi-year, large scale kind of systemic types of grants, right? Where it's usually systems that are impacted, like a health system or some type of research, scientific research. So those are the type of things that usually were attached historically to those type of funding. Thankfully, we are evolving to be a little bit more inclusive, so that we know that, to your point of kind of scale, and not everybody's going to be at that space, right? And so how do we help organizations get that space? They need funding to be able to grow. And so we recognize that. So we are trying to do better about giving multi-year funding, because that speaks to sustainability, it speaks to capacity building, all the things that are necessary for organizations to grow and be able to sustain themselves. So yes, we are. Again, strings attached. So we're looking at metrics. We're looking at you tracking your data. We're looking at you being able to get your outcomes and all. And I'll just say this: you don't have to do this alone. Like, that's what our role is to walk alongside you to make sure that you're successful. If we give you a grant, then our goal is for you to be successful, right? Because that's a judgment call on us, right? And so I just want you to know, it's not you having to do all this on your own. Like, our goal is to be a partner with you. The power dynamic hopefully is shifting a little bit. It's going to be there regardless, just because, but our goal is to make it as flat as possible. And so yes to more, but just understand, have your house in order, so that we can see you and lift you up, and then provide that support for you. And that will be a perfect time for you to come and call and ask and see if this is something that would be considered for a multi-year grant.
Okay, thank you. Ashley Douglas, did you want to, I know the answer, but I'm going to let you answer for United Way.
Yes, we do. I think that is actually the bulk of our funding historically, is our multi-year funding. It is a 3-year sort of funding cycle. So we fund organizations for 3 years worth of programmatic work at a time. We are, like, you know, Ashley mentioned, we are also kind of moving we had some learnings during COVID. We learned a lot with our North Texas Cares collective grant funding around more about some of the barriers that prevented smaller organizations and entities that we want to see be successful, but that may actually keep them from applying from larger, multi-year grant funding pools. And so we're working to create more opportunities. And I think we've done a pretty good job in the last year of creating additional funding opportunities where we are funding organizations that may not necessarily be ready for that multi-year funding. Because there are a lot of strings attached. We are very strict on, metrics and, overall income, impact outcomes, and what those look like. And so we are trying to, do a little bit more of, less of, I'm not going to say less of multi-year funding, but more funding that doesn't require as much of a strenuous process for our staff. And that also opens the doors for other nonprofits that are smaller in nature, that still need and require funding to kind of grow and increase the amount of work that they're doing. So, yeah.
Okay. And you bring up a good point too, which was another question, is do you all support startup organizations?
Absolutely. I'll just kind of, because I finished, I'll just go ahead and say yes. United Way does. I think we have started to do more of that. We have a collaboration, our nonprofit success initiative, a collaborative effort with CFT and State Fair of Texas, where we're working to help build the capacity of smaller nonprofit organizations. Southern Dallas Thrives in particular has provided some funding for nonprofit organizations that are in the Southern sector and that serve Southern sector residents, smaller grants in that particular arena. And then overall, we're just, our SIA program, our Social Innovation Accelerator program, is for entrepreneurial small nonprofits that really take an innovative approach at how they address, various societal issues. So there are some opportunities there, and we're really working to scope out additional ways in which we can provide support for that particular population of nonprofit partners.
Okay, thank you. Ashley from CFT, do you all support startups?
So I'll kind of be as transparent as I possibly can. I would say it depends, right? Okay. I say the realistic piece is I wouldn't say we don't, because we do, but is it, how likely is it? It's probably slimmer than all the rest of the agencies if you're established. And when I say established, I'm not saying you are, 100 plus budget. You could be a 25,000 budget, but you've been operating for 5 or 10 years. And also it depends on your niche, what, all these things, right? Are you in the community that we are not in, right? And so we were taking a chance on a startup because you have something that we don't. We have a relationship. You are serving in a capacity in a way that we are interested in, that no one else is. I'll also say that, we lean on United Way and their capacity building efforts to get people up to speed. So United Way does a really great job of providing those capacity building efforts for startups and smaller agencies. And we do a lot of kind of co-funding with United Way, right? So I think that's one way that we kind of, lean in and leverage so that it exposes us to them that we probably wouldn't otherwise have that exposure. So I just say yes, contingent. Okay. That, so anyways, sorry.
No, that's good. And I think that speaks to our earlier discussion about why it's important to feel safe in calling and starting those conversations, because like you said, it just depends. And sometimes when you read the guidelines online, you're just not sure. And so that's why that communication is important. Ms. Cass, did you want to add anything to the question about startups?
During my tenure, we generally didn't fund startups.
Okay.
And we didn't fund general operating.
Okay.
But, it's on a case-by-case basis, and, it's certainly worth a phone call.
Okay, thank you. And I think the last burning question for all fundraisers, especially new fundraisers who are trying to secure support for their organizations. the big question, how much funding should my nonprofit ask for? And so I know people get asked that question. And so I would love you all to really just share with the attendees, like the best way to determine that. I have my ways of how I determined it in my role, but please share your thoughts on that. And then after you all answer this, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Francois Booker-Drew to go to Q&A from the audience.
I'll go first because my response is going to be very brief. We always advise the nonprofit or the organization to ask for what you need. Often we would see a new organization or a smaller organization asking for minimal, a small amount. Maybe they would ask for 10,000 when they needed 30. And we always encourage, potential grantees to ask for what you need to really be successful in your project, your program, or your expansion. As part of having to review the decline, the proposals that were declined for funding, I can be honest and say there were times when the dollar amount was so small that the grant staff or the board felt like the amount could be obtained through other sources because it was so small.
Okay, thank you for that.
I will say, I would agree with Ms. Cass. Ask for what you need, but be also realistic about what you do. I think that's really important to consider, especially when you know that funders are looking at the impact metrics, the overall outcomes. Be realistic about what it is your organization can do. And I think utilize that as a platform to make the determination on what you need to ask for, what it takes to actually run the operations of what it is you can actually achieve in that grant period of time.
Thank you. Ashley?
Yes, I agree with that. I say, what are you asking for, right? And so there's a difference between just general operating, where I'm operating a program. Say, for example, your budget just normally is 50K. And you're asking us for 75% of your budget. That's probably not a good look, right? Diversity of funding is a real thing, and that's something that you need to understand. Are you asking because you're at a point where you're proving yourself and you've gotten great outcomes and the demand is such that you need to grow and so you may have a $50,000 budget, but you actually need to be at 100 for growth. That's a different proposal, that's a different pitch. So you just need to understand and be able to articulate that. Again, have a call and say this is what, because that conversation, that proposal looks a lot different from a funder based off of what you're asking for and what you may really mean, right? The last thing I'll say for us at CFT, if you look at our kind of grant history, the majority of our grants are going to be about 20K. I mean, that's our LOI. So just know that coming in, that's what we're going to usually, that's just the majority of it. And then to the point earlier about the multi-year funding, it just depends on the proposal, what you're asking for, and then it will grow. But it's just different. So that would be kind of the last thing I'll say about that is just ask for what you need for sure, but be very cognizant of what that looks like and being able to explain and say, because usually on a lot of proposals, they'll say, do you have additional funders at the table, right? And so we want to understand who else is supporting you, because the board will ask. We look at, I mean, when we present our case to the board, one of the questions is, what percent of this funding is CFT versus their whole, right? And so they're trying to understand the balance of, well, why are we providing them 75% of their budget? Like, who else is supporting them? That's important. So that's what we look at that as well.
Well, thank you. Thank each of you. It's been my pleasure and an honor to lead and moderate this conversation with you all. And so at this time, I will hand it back over to Dr. Booker-Drew for the next level of conversation. So thank you very much.
Tameka, thank you. Great job. And to our panelists, amazing content. Even in the chat box, there was a note about the content was so good. So thank you all. I want to open it up to our audience and have you ask any questions of our panelists. Is there anything that they said that, you know, you want to go deeper with? This, don't make a pitch, but you can let them know that you exist. Any questions?
I would like to ask, I guess, Ms. Douglas. Well, just anybody. You guys, well, Ms. Douglas specifically mentioned that United Way will support startups. So having a startup, what's the best way or the most effective way? I know that Ms. Cash, Mama Cash said to make that phone call, but I know that's a starting point, but are there certain things we need to have or be prepared when we make that phone call? Because mine is a startup and we are doing things on just money we've raised, but we could have a bigger impact if we did have more money. We could serve more people if we had more money.
So I would say, oftentimes, I really like to point small startups in our direction of our social innovation accelerator program. And the reason being is because there's so much that comes with being a participant in that cohort. Not only do you get some knowledge and a solid knowledge base around, you know, how to effectively turn your passions into business, which is the way I kind of like to talk about it. It really takes your entrepreneurial spirit and provides you with coaching opportunities, mentorship opportunities for corporations. And it gives you like a really good insight as to what funders will potentially be looking for. And a big part about what I mentioned earlier at the beginning of our call is, how do you message the impact that you're making? How do you talk about the work that you've already been doing in a way that is compelling to not only the funding community, but you know, potential participants as well? And so I always recommend SIA, depending or contingent upon what it is. There may be some other opportunities for funding there. And what we'll generally do is, once we get a phone call in community impact department, we will, you know, kind of talk about it amongst our departmental meetings and figure out, you know, what type of resources each individual or program can bring to the table as a resource for a potential nonprofit. So we can probably categorize it under SIA, but we can also say they may qualify for something under Southern Ellis Thrives, or they may qualify for something we're doing with our Health Innovation Challenge. It just all depends on everything that we have going on at that particular time. But we'll always try to provide resources in more than one program if that's possible.
All right, thank you.
No problem.
There are some questions in the chat box, and I'll start with the one. Ashley McIver wanted to know from development folks, she'd love to learn from you how you decide what to ask. That would be helpful to us as funders. Are we not clear? Could we be clear? How can we help with that?
And Ashley, I'm happy to answer just from my experience. So a lot of research goes into it. Oftentimes we do meet with funders and they tell us, we recommend you submit a request for this amount. So then it's very clear. If there is a notation in the grant guidelines saying we will only fund up to $25,000, then, you know, that's clear. But sometimes there's not that clarity. And so the approach that I've taken over the years is, one, I always look at the 990 of the grant maker. If they have a portal on their website that shows what they have funded, I look at other similar or like organizations, and I try to determine the amount of funding that they fund for agencies like ours or programs that are very similar to ours. And then I gauge it from that based on, of course, need and things like that. But that's kind of how we make determination of what to ask for when it's not clear from the funder or clear from the grant guidelines. Because I think nonprofits do get in the sense of you want to ask for what you need, but you try to put yourself in the mind of the person on the receiving end. You don't want to ask for too much. You don't know if your version of what's realistic is like completely unrealistic for them. And so I always look to see, especially if it's available, what they have funded that would be similar to what we're asking for, or an organization. And I can kind of gauge from that, and then I get in a range that would be feasible for us to be considered.
Akila has a question, and she says, I asked about the funders' commitment to racial equity. What percentage of your funding is dedicated to BIPOC, and how do you directly, as well as how do directly impacted voices contribute to your funding practices and priorities?
And I'll just make note, I was responding to Ashley McIver's question around what are the type of questions that I ask of funders, not that I'm necessarily asking them right now for them to respond on behalf of their organization. But if you know.
I can be very transparent to say, you know, we don't have an explicit set of funding that is designated for BIPOC leaders. I think that would, I think there's ways that we're working on that as advocates within our own individual spaces, but we're not there yet.
I would second those sentiments. We are not there yet. I'm very honest and transparent about our journey to getting there and what that's been looking like. To be very frank, we've had to do a lot of internal work before we can start having these conversations and really, you know, shift our practices. We had to have, I mean, you got to start from within when it comes to this work. And so we are not there yet. We are working to figure out ways that make sense for us to get there and how we do that and what that looks like. We're evaluating all of that. And so I'm glad to see us doing that part, but we're on our journey.
But I mean, keep asking that question, Akila. I mean, and everyone else on here, keep asking it. I mean, because, you know, part of our infographics has equity added and all those things, right? And so we have to make sure that there's some accountability to that. So spread the word as you guys are continuing. There's nothing wrong with accountability, and it's actually a good thing. What I learned on the risk management thing seminar yesterday was talking about transparency. If you don't have transparency, you don't have accountability. If you don't have accountability, you have higher risk. And so that risk for us is not being true to what we're putting out there. If we say that we value equity and that we're working to be support and contribute to a more equitable community, then that should be center. And so keep that in the forefront of us as funders.
And Akila, I was going to add right quick, just for everyone on the call who might not know what BIPOC stands for, you may want to spell that. I mean, say what the acronym stands for, just in case.
Black, Indigenous, people of color.
Thank you very much, sir.
And when, I mean, for Ashley, I mean, earlier you talked about, you know, being able to, you know, clearly, you know, share your vision, your goals. If one of your goals is to take care of that demographic, is that going to hurt you in the grant process if you guys aren't there and ready to fund those type of initiatives?
I think I don't know. Oh, are you saying if it's not explicit, is that going to hurt you? Is that what your question was?
But I mean, in my passion in telling you guys what our goal is and what we want to do, we want to serve people in that demographic and those communities, to make sure, like for me, to make sure they have access to quality mental health care. If we're saying that and you guys as an organization are there ready to, I guess, target those kind of people, is that going to hurt my grant?
I will say no. And the reason I say that is because currently, in terms of when we look at the overall dynamics of the number or who we're impacting with our dollars, it's majority people of color, specifically at United Way. That is the majority of the client base that we are impacting with the grant dollars that we're providing to community-based organizations, 75 to 80% actually. So I don't think that it's going to hurt your application in any way to explicitly name that. I think it's good for a funder to know that, especially if they are having an issue with serving a particular population and they want to do more of that. I think it gives them a very clear path to be able to do that effectively. So I don't believe that it will hurt your application in any way.
And I'll say this, I'm not on the panel and I chose not to be, but what I am hearing from funders is, at least in this area, I won't say statewide because that's a different conversation, but at least in this area, funders are interested and want to know and are trying to figure out ways of who is not on the radar. And North Texas Cares was one prime example of, I had folks coming to me and saying, hey, are you familiar with this group? And I think that more and more funders are trying to get into, especially areas like a South and West Dallas, and trying to figure out how they can support it better. So I don't think it will hurt you. I think you need to emphasize that that's the population that you're working with, to be very honest. And I think what a lot of nonprofits don't do well is articulate, especially in a COVID, how their work, if they're not doing direct COVID services, they count themselves out. And that's so wrong. You are doing COVID work, because when you're doing work with people who have been impacted by COVID, you are doing that work. So if you're doing mental health, you need to call out how mental health is going to be problematic even in the long term, especially in our community, because of the amount of loss that we've experienced. So it's helping nonprofits to better articulate their story so that funders go, I get it, that makes sense. And for many, they're so busy asking for the money that they don't tell the story very well and use data to tell the story. And so it can be done.
Well, I'm gonna add to that is, I don't want you guys to confuse an explicit commitment as the work not being done, right? And so what that means is we may not have a statement that says CFT is, committing like JP Morgan Chase committing at, so many millions of dollars of funding to, BIPOC. We may not be doing that, but if you go look at our data, you'll see a big uptick in how many BIPOC-led agencies that we've been funding. You'll see a specific target. If you look at a map, you'll see us targeting where the funding has gone, and it's gone in our rural communities / the West Dallas, South Dallas. So there's some strategic efforts being happened, even if it's not at an organizational level. So I just want to kind of clarify that. Yes. Trust and believe, the tick is up. Yes. With everybody's on notice. We know it just may not be an explicit call out. So just want to say that.
And that's why Heritage. Oh, go on, Ashley. Go on.
No. I was going to say one last thing I'll add to that is that kind of some sheer reflections of our work in general. Southern Dallas Thrives is focused specifically on the Southern sector. This is a corporate and a philanthropic partnership, but it's a targeted area that focuses on specific things for a particular community for a reason. So that goes to show, I think funders and nonprofits are in support of this work. They're creating their own ways to, innovatively do it and approach it. So I don't think it's ever an issue to name that, like Francois mentioned, and call that out. I think it is actually more of a benefit to you.
And that is one of the reasons why we started Heritage, is because, as Akilah mentioned, the percentage of dollars nationally that are given to organizations led by Black women, it's dismal. And so I want to give Akilah the opportunity to talk about Heritage as we get ready to close this amazing conversation. This is one of many that we'll be hosting, but I want to share with you about Heritage and how you can become involved with the work that we're trying to do to change the narrative around philanthropy. So Akilah, you're on.
All right. Well, yes, we'll make sure we end on time. So good evening. And first, thank you to all of our wonderful panelists, your dear friends of Heritage, and to many of our individual members. Thank you to Tameka, one of our founding member, who helped in facilitating this conversation, and always Dr. Francois Booker-Drew, who is working with our members to ensure that we have wonderful programming throughout this year. And so just quickly, as we wrap up, I would like to just direct y'all and sharing a little screen here to our new website, heritagegivingfund.org. This is the great place for you to learn everything about us, learn about our history, as well as get an understanding around, what our impact is and who are we funding, what is our grant making process and applications, as well as information about getting involved, which includes, the opportunities for you to join us and becoming a member of Heritage. We are a collective of Black women of varying economic statuses and backgrounds who commit to sow a seed of a minimum of $500 annually for it to be pulled together for us to make grant making decisions annually to support Black women, Black female-led nonprofit organizations, and those that predominantly benefit Black people here in North Texas and throughout the state. So for those also, again, many of you may have already been directed to this page to register for events, but please click on our events link. So today we have our funders discussion for those who may be interested in becoming a member or just interested in learning more about, what does it mean to be a part of this giving circle. Please, next Friday, we will have a new member interest meeting. It will be virtual. So just click the register button and you'll get the Zoom information, as well as each month you'll see some of our upcoming speaking sessions. So in May 13th, we have, getting the grant. And then obviously, continue through the process and life cycle of it. Now that you have it, now what? What do you need to do to remain in compliance, and so on and so on. And then also, just for those of our members who are on here, thank you to all of you in the ways that you contribute to the Giving Circle through your financial contributions, but also a significant number of you contribute your time and talents, helping to facilitate many of our public events, but also the internal operations of our Giving Circle, and making sure that we do, maintain who we are and whose we are, and prioritizing the voices and needs and leadership of Black women. So please check out who our members are on our member page. You can scroll through. It's being updated regularly. So, feel free. Don't feel like, well, I want to join today. Yes, send your headshot and photo after you've completed your pledge form. And then lastly, how do I do that? If you go to our Get Involved link, you'll see information on how to become a member, general information. Everyone can submit your membership pledge form. This is general information about you. Once you've decided, yes, I want to commit at least $500 or up to $1,000 as a voting member, as well as then you select to make a donation, and you can support it there as well. It's important to note, even if you're not a Black woman, if you're not a person of color, we still invite you to join us on this journey and pooling our resources together for the ongoing investment in Black women's voices and leadership. So thank you to all of you for your time, for your interest in this conversation. For those of you who lead nonprofit organizations, we absolutely celebrate, recognize, and honor you for your tenacity, your sacrifices, your hard work, and all that you do to help uplift and sustain our communities and help us to ultimately work towards the full liberation of our people. So I don't know if I believe that is the end of this session. So again, thank you to all of our speakers. We really do appreciate all of your time, and please, consider making a contribution, making a donation. A gift of any size is appreciated. 10, 15, 20, 100, 50,000 for our funders. Whatever you feel in your heart to please, join us in investing in Black women. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful
everyone.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Have a good evening. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.